Excellent.
Some of the hardest problems in the world exist far above the planet. Our job? To launch the smartest solutions, to protect our satellites, clean up our clutter, to propel breakthroughs in propulsion, to learn more about our place in the universe, to outpace emerging threats. Every day, the Aerospace Corporation uses the latest technologies to ensure our nation's safety and leadership in space.
Hi, welcome to the Space Policy Show. Today we have Mick Gleason. He's talking about what the expiration of New START could mean for U.S. Space Forces. Just a couple of reminders. We are here every Tuesday and Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern. You can find us at aerospace.org/policy. You'll see a couple of buttons there where you can click on our papers, check out our experts. You can watch previous episodes. Also, while you're there, please don't forget to sign up for our alerts on paper releases and events like this one. We are interactive, so if you would like, please go ahead, join the chat, put your name in, click enter, ask the questions. I will be monitoring those. And I guess let's take it over to Mick. Mick, thank you for coming. We're really happy that you're here.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks everybody for showing up today. Really appreciate it. I'd also like to make sure we all thank Luke Riesbeck for being the co-author on this paper, but she wasn't able to join us today, but contributed greatly to the paper. With that said, I would like to speak a little bit about the paper that this presentation is about. Next slide. This presentation today is based on the paper Non-Interference with National Technical Means, the Status Quo Will Not Survive, which the Center for Space Policy and Strategy put out back in January of this year. If you haven't seen it or haven't read it, I think it would be great if you'd go to the link provided on the slide there and download it and read it. It goes into more depth than I'll be able to go into today. So please consider that. So while we're talking about the paper, I would like to give you a little overview of kind of the journey that it took to arrive at this paper. It's not that long. It's about 12 pages long, so hopefully a quick read, but hopefully you'll find it very interesting. The premise that occurred to me about a year ago was that, hey, New START is ending in February 2021. Myself, as a career space professional, I was wondering, will that have any impact on the U.S. national security space community? Because as a space guy, I never really paid too much attention to nuclear arms control treaties. I was never in the missile career field like some of my colleagues of the past. But I thought, I wonder if there is something in there. I knew there was something about NTMs in New START. So I thought, let me go ahead and find out if there's some implications. I was kind of doubtful, but I thought, hey, it could be interesting to investigate. I talked to many people to begin with, and most people were pretty skeptical that the New START treaty was really anything significant for the space community, the status of the New START treaty. People brought up the fact that the protections for national technical means of verification that are in the treaty, it's very ambiguous. The NTMs are not defined. I can't say that word. Bad stuff, bad behavior sometimes happens in space anyway, and so forth. And so, it's probably not that important. Oh, and besides that, what about China? China is not part of the New START treaty. What about commercial remote sensing? Does that make NTMs for treaty verification really that important anyway? And so there was a lot of skepticism in my own mind and in other people's minds when I started this project. But surprisingly, as I start to scratch the surface and dig in more deeper, I concluded that, yeah, there is definitely some significant implications for the national security space community, U.S. Space Forces, with the status of the New START treaty. So with that said, a little bit of background on the New START treaty. The New START Treaty was signed in 2011. It's a nuclear arms control treaty where the U.S. and Russia agreed to certain limits on nuclear weapons. It includes on-site verifications, significant on-site verifications, data sharing agreements, and so forth on the launch vehicles and on, of course, the warheads also, and on various delivery systems. Now, when the treaty is good for 10 years. That's why it's expiring in February of 2021, just 10 months from now. There is a provision in the treaty that it can be extended for 5 years, and without the treaty having to be renegotiated, as long as Russia and the United States agree to this extension. Currently, the arms control experts I've talked to consider the prospects for that 5-year extension to be somewhat dim. Doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It could maybe happen quickly as a timeline kind of marches towards February of 2021. But we ought to be thinking a little bit ahead and find out if an extension is not made. Regardless of the 5-year extension, the treaty only allows for the 5-year extension to if that happens. So that would take it to 2026. 5 years is not that long, especially when you talk about nuclear arms control treaty negotiations. And currently, as far as I'm aware, there's not really any initiative or efforts going on to negotiate a new nuclear arms control treaty between the U.S. and Russia. So the premise of this paper is like, what happens if New START ends? Not saying it's not going to continue or a new treaty won't come along, but in the meantime, we should be prepared for that eventuality. So what does New START actually say about national technical means of verification and the protections in the treaty? Next slide, please. So I'm going to just read this to you because it's a little bit wordy, but it states, for the purpose of ensuring verification of compliance with the provisions of this treaty, each party undertakes to use national technical means of verification, not to interfere with the national technical means of verification of the other party operating in accordance with this article, and not to use concealment measures to impede verification by national technical means of verification. So it's very important in U.S. policy and negotiating treaties that the United States has the ability to verify compliance with a treaty. Otherwise, the United States' policy is to not sign up for a treaty if verification is not going to happen. And so I don't know if you can hear that, but unfortunately my yard service showed up about almost to the minute that I started this presentation, so hopefully that's not too distracting for you. So anyway, verification of treaties is very important in the treaty world, and non-interference with national technical means of treaty verification is what has enabled these nuclear arms control treaties to be signed anyway. If you could go on to the next slide. So what are national technical means of verification? What does that mean? As I mentioned previously, it's somewhat ambiguous, or very ambiguous, depending on how you look at it. But first of all, we can call them the systems and sensors that constitute, I'm sorry, they have never been defined, all right? The US and Russia have preferred to keep the precise definition and identity of NTMs ambiguous. And due to this purposeful ambiguity, you can make an argument that the United States and Russia have extended the ban on interference with national technical means of verification to a de facto ban on interfering with the entire national security space constellation of the other. I think that's a reasonable judgment. That's what my research has shown. If you'd like to get into more depth, because I know some people may disagree with that, please refer to the paper. I tried to dive into that a little bit more extensively. So if you could stay right there for a moment on that slide. So the key argument of the paper, now that we got kind of those definitions out of the way, is that the treaty provisions of the New START Treaty on not interfering with national technical means of verification helped establish the legitimacy of overflight of NTM of other countries, and particularly the US and Russia in this case. And so we should probably explore that a little bit deeper. So a little bit of background. 1957, as many of you know, we had Sputnik, and the right of peaceful overflight was pretty much established and agreed upon between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and that was a well-established concept. But the key word here is peaceful purposes. So the United States has began arguing immediately almost that peaceful purposes meant non-aggressive. We could use space for telecommunications, for weather, and for surveillance, and for looking at what's going on in other countries. The Soviet Unions did not necessarily agree to that definition of non-aggressive. Throughout the 60s, they protested U.S. what they called spy sats at the time, because they argued that it was simply espionage, that they were taking pictures for targeting and so forth, and for spying. And so the Soviet Union never agreed throughout the 60s that NTM overflight, national technical means, taking pictures of their country, was a legitimate peaceful use of outer space. So what changed? In 1972, the US and the Soviet Union signed the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Within the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty was a provision prohibiting interference with national technical means of verification. If you could go back one slide, please. Thank you. So the words that are here in New START are almost verbatim, very, very similar to what was in the 1972 ABM Treaty. Those words were also in the interim agreement, also called SALT I. It was in SALT II. Those words carried through into the INF Treaty, into the START Treaty, all the way to today into the New START Treaty. Very similar words with very similar meanings, that the US and Russia are not supposed to interfere with each other's national technical means of verification. So if the New START ends, that will break the continuity going back 50 years of a US-Russian treaty agreement, legally binding treaty agreement, not to interfere with each other's national technical means. So that's kind of a big deal, that 50 years of continuity in agreeing to not interfere is going to stop. Now, going back to 1972 and that ABM treaty for a moment, for the purposes of nuclear arms control treaty verification, starting with the ABM treaty, the Soviet Union did agree that spy satellites, photo reconnaissance satellite overflight of the Soviet Union was therefore a non-aggressive use of outer space. And that has carried through to today, as I just mentioned, through New START. So my question is, once again, this is a thought piece, is now that the treaty law, that continuity will end after 50 years, will that affect the legitimacy of NTM overflight over other countries? I don't know, but I think we should start thinking about it. If you could move forward at one slide, please. So with that in mind, and with the end of that long line of nuclear arms control treaties, potentially less than a year from now, my argument is also that the strategic context for which our national security space forces have operated in is going to change. And so I think that's significant. We should begin looking at that. So another problem I grappled with in this paper was, how do we get at this problem? Like, how do we show that NTMs matter or not, or I'm sorry, that the prohibition on interference with NTMs really matters or not? So a former colleague of mine had the great idea, suggested it to me. Eric, thank you very much for the idea, to look at 4 alternative futures. And so if you go to the next slide, please. I decided, yeah, let's look at what could happen. Let's just pick a couple of alternatives and see where things could go. Let's see, make sure I'm on track here. All right, so this table we're going to dwell on here for pretty much the rest of this presentation. So go ahead and try to pull your screen a little closer or make it as big as possible, because I'm going to walk through pretty much each one of these cells. Sorry, I know it's kind of an eye chart, But as we go through it, hopefully it will begin to make sense to you. Now, across the top, you'll see, first of all, this is a thought experiment. I don't know what the actual future is, of course, but this helps us kind of think through the problem. So on the top line, so to speak, you can see there's kind of two major categories: NTM collection requirements, the amount and difficulty, and the stability of the space domain, with many subcategories underneath the stability of the space domain. The disruptive policy changes, opportunities in the far right column, we'll set those aside for later. So now I'm going to go through each one of these rows of the alternative futures. You have A, B, C, and D marching down the page there. All right, and then as I go through these, they'll start to become more clear. So first of all, let's say in February or March next year from now, we enter kind of a regime of non-codified bilateral mutual restraint. The New START treaty is gone, and we decide, the U.S. decides by itself, and Russia decide by itself that, you know what, we're just going to kind of let inertia carry us forward. We're not going to really do anything different. We're just going to keep going about business as we have been going about business with the current trends and so forth. And so the overflight legitimacy is not questioned. Interference with the NTM kind of remains the status quo. Not really too much is happening here. However, I argue in the paper that the U.S. and Russia, as the traditional space powers, their behavior in outer space does influence how other countries behave in outer space and what they perceive as legitimate behavior in outer space. So if the U.S. and Russia have removed any legally binding constraints on interference with NTMs, other countries might feel somewhat less restrained in some ways also. And that goes right on to the next column on norms development. As the only legally binding treaty-based bilateral treaty explicitly prohibiting interference with national technical means of verification, I'm thinking if that goes away, it could have a chilling effect on voluntary norms of behavior for outer space. They kind of say, well, what's the point of developing voluntary norms of behavior for outer space when the only legally binding constraint has been removed? So I argue in the paper, you can look for more detail, that's going to have a chilling effect on norms development. Also for space control activities, whether it's the US or Russia, removing that legally binding treaty constraint could lower the threshold for military activity, aggressive or offensive military activity in outer space. Hey, no more treaty constraint. We can do whatever we want, right? No, I'm not arguing that, but I'm speculating that someone might someday. So therefore, if we go over to the crisis stability column, I'm saying that crisis stability will be more difficult because with a lower threshold for aggressive actions in space, with less attention or energy behind norms development and so forth, that crisis stability, the misunderstanding, miscalculation, misperception, whatever the word you want to use is, starts getting a little bit on shakier ground, so that the so crisis stability will be less shaky. So overall, you can see that, yeah, interference doesn't increase, legitimacy is still fine. Legitimacy is not being challenged, but overall, the stability of the space domain may somewhat take a hit when and if New START goes away. Now let's go all the way back over to the far left column, where we talk about NTM collection requirements. When New START goes away, we're also going to have the end of on-site inspections to verify compliance with the New START treaty. So therefore, the collection requirements from space will likely increase, creating a higher workload on our workforce, our space forces, to keep track. It seems like a pretty high priority to keep very close track of Russia's nuclear weapons and their nuclear forces, which will be significantly harder without the on-site inspections to get ground truth in many respects about Russian nuclear forces. So that's why in that column, it just says increased amount. But that means there is, once again, that even if we do nothing, and just kind of hope inertia and momentum just carries through assuming the strategic context that's held over the last 50 years is going to carry through, I think it could still have some kind of effect. I'd like to pause for a second. I've been rambling on here for quite a few minutes. Rebecca, have any questions popped up yet?
Yes, I would like to ask you, what would you say is your key takeaway from the first row? What do you want to leave the audience with for that?
Thanks. Thanks for that question. I guess the most important thing is it's kind of a wake-up call, I guess, for the national security space community, that a do-nothing approach is probably not the best way to move forward into the future here, because doing nothing is going to also have some potentially negative consequences for the stability of the space domain. Is it all right if I move on then, Rebecca?
Yes, please go ahead.
All right. So going on to the next alternative future. Now I just made up these alternative futures off the top of my head to try to tease out some differences that could happen in the future. So, we'll take that for what it's worth, all right? But it helped me think through these things. So kind of as an alternative to non-codified bilateral mutual restraint between Russia and the US, I said, okay, well, what about if they actually agree, make some kind of new agreement? It doesn't have to be a treaty. How about a memorandum of understanding? Some kind of codified bilateral mutual restraint where the US and Russia sign a piece of paper that says, hey, we're going to carry through non-interference with national technical means of verification, even though we don't have a treaty to verify right now, just because we think it helps the stability of the space domain. So as you can see, once again, I'm going to start with overflight legitimacy, status quo, nobody challenges it, interference with national technical means, current trends continue, status quo with interference, no really uptick or increase above the current status quo of any kind of interference. Third countries, China, India, France, Japan, whoever it may be, sees that Russia and the United States have signed an agreement not to interfere with each other. That would probably have a nice influence or some kind of influence on other countries' behavior, and would help maintain the current status quo under New START prohibitions on interference. Likewise for norms, likewise for space control, there would still be some kind of agreement threshold. The threshold for aggressive space control or offensive space control activities would remain close to the same. It's not as quite as stringent as a legally binding treaty agreement, but having some kind of written agreement would make commanders pause and think about if they want to cross that threshold, which would also help keep the crisis stability at, let's say, status quo activities. So as you can see across—
Hey, Mick, I have a question for you from one of our viewers. Do you see a role of partner nations like the EU playing a significant role in helping form new treaties or influencing what happens going forward?
Yes, definitely. That's in the scenario C, multilateral mutual restraint. So I'll answer that. I want to make one more point about bilateral mutual restraint and some kind of codified bilateral mutual restraint. And that is that if we want to maintain the status quo, even though there's still going to be more requirements on our NTMs to track nuclear forces, so it's not purely status quo, the takeaway from the scenario B is probably some kind of proactive approach may be needed to maintain the status quo as much as possible. Talk with the Russians, figure out what we can do. To answer the question, I'd like to move into scenario C, the multilateral mutual restraint, unless you had anything else right now, Becca?
I would just, I think you touched on, what the key takeaway was with row B, so you can move on to C.
All right, thanks. All right, so European Union, other countries, will they play a role? Under multilateral mutual restraint, this could potentially happen in a number of ways. First of all, there could be, let's say the U.S. and Russia sign a bilateral agreement, maybe we could, maybe other countries would like to join. Maybe like-minded nations to start off with. Maybe the Five Eyes, France, Japan, Germany, some other countries would say, yes, let's sign on with this also, assuming that Russia and the U.S. would agree, and maybe China could eventually sign. But yeah, so starting with the core of a bilateral treaty, maybe that could be expanded out, some kind of written MOU, voluntary, maybe not a treaty. Ideally, a legally binding treaty someday. But I think that may be a bridge too far, given the current geopolitical situation. So at a minimum, some kind of voluntary agreement. Thank you. Hang on, I just got a nice cup of hot tea to help my throat here.
Oh, perfect. Hey, we have a question. Do you mind me interrupting, Mick?
Sure, no, that'd be great.
Craig asked, how do we preserve the capabilities of the U.S. nuclear detection system and space-based systems required for nuclear command, control, and communications, NC3, from Russian or Chinese interference in this post-New START scenario? Great question, Craig. Thank you.
Yeah, Craig, that's probably the million-dollar question, right? Is how do we preserve those capabilities? That's I guess that's what the U.S. Space Forces are focused on right now. I don't think I'm qualified to really speak too much on that, and so I'd like to defer. We will get a little bit touch upon some of that in a minute on what another alternative future scenario may be down in scenario 4, the no mutual restraint scenario. But that's General Raymond is working hard right now to figure out how to make sure we preserve capabilities or defend and protect our capabilities. All right, thank you, Rebecca. So in the multilateral mutual restraint, Russia, U.S. bilateral, perhaps that could be built upon with other countries, including the European Union. Another potential route, which would be a huge breakthrough, would be the UN Security Council, if the 5 permanent members, which include Russia and China, UK, France, and the US, agreed that there should be some kind of national UN Security Council resolution prohibiting interference with national technical means of verification for the sake of the stability of the space domain. I mean, that'd be a huge breakthrough if China, Russia, and the US and other countries agreed to that. So given all those there's many different paths that potential multilateral mutual restraint could occur. However, and you can see in the chart there, there would be more restraint, among third countries. Norms development would be encouraged. Crisis stability would be a higher threshold than there currently is against interfering with NTMs. Crisis stability would benefit once again as the chance for misunderstanding, miscalculation is reduced. And so I think this, though, however, is a pretty idealistic and probably the least realistic of these scenarios, potentially. You're free to disagree. And so it's been very hard, as we all know, in the geopolitical environment to negotiate multilateral agreements concerning space security. I guess the takeaway from this future is there'd be a lot of benefits. Once again, there'd be more NTM collection requirements because the loss of on-site inspections and whatever that means for our forces that track, our space forces that are charged with keeping track of Russia's nuclear forces. They'd have a higher workload, and so it's once again the status quo is not going to be maintained if New START ends for the space community. Any other questions right now, Rebecca?
Yes, you have one from Melissa. It says, I haven't heard any mention of North Korea. Would they also be included in a multilateral?
Yeah, I kind of doubt that North Korea would be included in a multilateral. It'd be nice if somehow there's a change in North Korea that would bring them on board with the rest of the international community and a lot of these stabilizing type of activities. But I think that's going to be a real difficult thing to accomplish. And I can hear the leaf blower coming by right now, so I'm sorry about that. Sorry I didn't cancel my lawn service today.
We can still hear you loud and clear, Mick.
Okay, I hope it's not too distracting.
No.
All right, great. So I'd like to go into the final scenario, no mutual restraint. So let's say we wake up in March of 2021 or middle of February 2021, and U.S. Space Forces and Russian Space Forces, they go, hey, you know what? There's no more constraint on us. No more legally binding treaty constraint on us as clear as the New START Treaty, restraining us from interfering with each other's NTMs. Let's go to town. And oh, by the way, since the legitimacy was based, the overflight legitimacy of NTMs was based on nuclear arms control treaty, and now that has ended, you know, we can defend our territory against countries targeting us and so forth and taking pictures of our sensitive sites. And so in this scenario, overflight legitimacy is called into question and challenged. Just like if someone's going to fly an airplane across your border to take pictures, you know, you would potentially challenge that, right? You know, you're defending your sovereignty, defending your country. Interference with NTM would go up significantly, a large increase, as you can see on the chart there. Shaping third country behavior would also be less restrained. Other countries out there, whether it's China, India, North Korea, and a number of other countries, spacefaring countries, would say, hey, it looks like it's a free-for-all out there, so they alter their behavior, showing less restraint. Norms development is just dead. You know, it's unattainable to get voluntary norms in such an environment. The threshold for aggressive space control activities or offensive space control activities is completely removed, and therefore crisis stability would also be shaken. And so you can see there's a lot of red. It looks more like a deep salmon coloring for some reason on the screen, but you can see that in that scenario, I say the stability of the space domain would be affected negatively in that case. And the NTM collections, there wouldn't only be more requirements on our NTM forces, but it would be harder. It'd be more difficult because they're having to fight through more interference and maybe potentially even defend themselves to get into position to do what they do and gather some information. So those are the four alternative futures. You know, non-codified, bilateral, restraint, you know, kind of just go about business as usual or try to, codified mutual restraint, multilateral restraint, and then no restraint. Now on the bottom, you can see I also add in some disruptive policy change opportunities that if New START ends, that it could present. But I'm going to hold off on that for right now and ask Rebecca if she has more questions for me.
You have two new questions. Ben asked, with China launching roughly half of the total number of the world's large satellites for the past several years and growing ASAT capabilities, is it really possible to maintain the status quo without their agreement into any of these scenarios?
So when I refer to the status quo, I'm mainly talking, or the status quo with the between the U.S. and Russia. China is a difficult problem for this paper, so I tried to set it aside. The way this paper argues about China and other countries' behavior is just that column that talks about shaping third country behavior. If the U.S. and Russia show less constraint, the U.S. and Russia have no legally binding commitments to not interfere with each other's NTMs, I think that's going to stimulate even further bad behavior among other countries. Whether we agree if other countries are showing any restraint nowadays or not anyway, you know, I would argue that there is actually a decent degree of restraint in outer space right now among countries, although things are changing. The current trends are not that great, but this would make it even worse. It would accelerate the negatives trends that are going on for concerning stability in space.
Got it. Your second question is from John. Moving to the future, D, I have a question. I've been asking in venues such as this for a decade is the following. What constitutes an act of war in space? I've yet to receive an answer. Nobody knows.
Yeah. I did not scratch research on that one. I know the UN Charter allows any country to defend itself. It's like the primary number one concept is that the right to self-defense is not diminished by any treaties or by the United Nations Charter or anything. And so if a country in its right to self-defense feels that its self-defense is threatened, that country might consider it an act of war. Who gets to decide? Who gets to disagree? I think it's up to each country to decide. Probably. We're getting really on shaky ground here, so I'm going to just stop right there because I'm not a legal expert or an international law expert. Right. So I stop. Thanks.
Great. We had a comment from Earl, which I'm just going to share for those who maybe aren't queued into the chat. But Earl said, we are very focused on defending high value assets, including NDS. We're pressing forward with defensive capabilities, regardless of whether or not there's a renewal of START. Does Russia and China have developed capabilities to threaten these while under START? I don't know if you have any thoughts you want to share, but Earl, thank you for sending that.
So I think just to reinforce the idea that current trend lines are not necessarily very good concerning contested space. So this paper is pointing out that if New START ends, I keep saying when New START ends, but I want to make sure I say if New START ends. If New START ends, those trends will probably accelerate even more in a negative direction.
Okay. I have a question for you. What other futures are plausible? Maybe that you haven't covered, some other alternate reality scenarios.
So of course there's an infinite number of futures. I tried to take 4 very discrete different futures here just for the analytical methodology but blends of these 4 futures are definitely possible, which once again leads to probably an infinite number of alternative futures. I think probably the most likely future is some combination of the non-codified bilateral mutual restraint, where people just kind of shrug their shoulders after hearing this presentation and reading the paper and go about their business. And February comes along, if New START is not agreed upon, people just try, inertia will carry the day. However, over time, maybe it might take a long time, but gradually or suddenly, interference could start increasing, and all the other cells in that table could start getting more difficult. If interference starts increasing, it makes the NTM collections job more difficult. And so I think probably the first scenario is probably the most likely, some variation of that, but where once that constraint is moved for aggressive space control activities, and that threshold is lowered, things could gradually get worse in that area.
Okay, great. I have a couple more questions for you. Does the ITU convention prohibit interference?
Oh, thanks for that question. So I dug into that. I kept looking for things that would undermine my whole argument about the prohibitions on interfering with national technical means. So the ITU convention does prohibit harmful interference with the radio transmissions. I can't remember the exact words in Article 45 of the ITU. However, Article 48 of the ITU convention says it doesn't apply to military forces. And so the U.S. military, from what I understand, complies with the ITU, voluntarily complies with the ITU prohibition on harmful interference. But we don't, the U.S. military and the Russians and other countries don't have to, because their military forces, because of Article 48.
Well, thank you for that. That actually leads me into my next question. Are there any negotiations going on with Russia to replace New START, like a New START 2 or something similar?
There has been some discussion. I'm not a nuclear arms control expert, but I've been, since I wrote this paper, trying to pay attention and keep a finger on what's going on. The arms control experts I have talked to consider the prospects dim. There has been some talk, as far as I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, the U.S. position is before agreeing to extend it, we'd like to bring China into that treaty. Some people are skeptical that that's going to happen.
Great. Okay, so I have another question for you. Under New START, NTM overflight is a legitimate activity. If New START expires and the legitimacy of NTM overflight expires with it, how does that interact with the idea that quote unquote space is no longer a sanctuary?
That's a very good question. We've been hearing for a few years now the rhetoric and the mindset that space is no longer a sanctuary. And so I think while we're saying that, we need to think about what does that say about the legitimacy of overflight. Are we saying that since space is no longer a sanctuary, NTMs don't have a right to overflight anymore? I'm not quite sure, but I think whoever the powers may be should think carefully and through the idea that, hey, if the legitimacy of overflight goes away when New START goes away, what is the interrelationship with the idea that space is no longer a sanctuary? It's a difficult question. I don't know if I have the answer, but I think there's some kind of interrelationship there that needs to be thought through. Maybe it'll be my next paper.
Excellent. So I've opened it up. If anybody who's watching has questions, please feel free to send them to me. I'm going to ask Mick, what is the key takeaway that you want to leave the audience with today?
As a career space professional, not someone who usually follows nuclear arms control, in this case, I think all my fellow career space professionals need to pay attention to what's going on with New START and start thinking about what the implications are if it goes away for the space community.
Thank you. So we have a question from Craig. Is it possible to renegotiate the Outer Space Treaty to include other weaponization of space? I don't know if you can answer that, but I asked it anyways.
Well, anything is possible. I think that's unlikely, though. I think the Outer Space Treaty has served us very well for over 50 years, 53, 55 years, something like that now. Opening up the Outer Space Treaty could have a lot of minuses. The things that have worked well might go away, given the current geopolitical tensions around the world for various reasons. Opening up that treaty is probably unlikely, and it's pretty good. It's served us well for 55 years. Opening it up to new things could carry some high risks.
Okay, great. I don't see any more questions. I'm going to give it just a second if that's okay with you, Mick. We really appreciate having you here today. I enjoyed hearing your thoughts on what the future could hold for New START. Oh, we have a question from Lewis. Okay, how does the expiration of New START affect the Space Force's overall risk posture, i.e. more defense, more offense, or a hybrid?
Yeah, I'm not the right person to ask about our U.S. Space Force defense posture, but I would assume that, if it ends, start looking for indications on changes of behavior from Russia and see if that can be associated with the end of New START, and then see if there's any proactive measures that we need to take to start talking to the Russians.
Great. We have a question from Melissa. She said, if international waters begin at the 12-mile limit, is there some method for deciding where free space begins over a country? I'm not sure if you're also the right person to answer that, but.
Yeah, that's a very international law legal question. So I think I'd prefer to set that aside. But regardless, the idea of overflight and the legitimacy of overflight, your airspace goes up so far, I'm not quite sure how far it is, where you have the right to defend yourself by shooting down intruders or somehow diverting them. And so if the legitimacy of overflight, whether it's 300 miles high or 600 miles high or whatever the case may be, is could be challenged, I don't know what could happen. And I don't really know the answer to your question. Sorry.
Oh, no problem. Mick is not a lawyer, for those who are watching. He just plays one on TV. Great. Well, so we don't have any more questions. So again, Mick, thank you so much for coming. We're so fortunate to have you on our show today. Next week's episode is Large Constellation Disposal Hazards with Bill Ayler. Again, visit aerospace.org/policy, sign up for our alerts, check out past episodes, read our papers, check out experts profiles like Mick here. Thank you again. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.